All right. So welcome to Human Trafficking and Fair Trade. And this session is presented by NC Stop Human Trafficking and Fair Traders Project. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about how Fair Traders Project is also NC Stop Human Trafficking, because it is. It's actually a program of NC Stop Human Trafficking. And you'll understand why NC Stop Human Trafficking has a program like this by the end of the session. Real quick, be sure to, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box so I'll be able to see them. They might get lost in the chat box, and I would hate to not be able to answer some questions. Also, let me introduce myself. I'm Melinda Sampson, the Community Outreach Coordinator for NC Stop Human Trafficking. I have been with NC Stop Human Trafficking for a little bit more than 3 years, and I came here from a career in journalism after I met men who were being trafficked for labor in North Carolina. As a journalist, I was doing a report on farm workers and met men who were being trafficked for labor. So that's how I got into the advocacy field. So with that, let's get started. So NC Stop Human Trafficking has a vision for a state free of human trafficking and a mission to create communities actively working to abolish human trafficking. And we do that in 4 action items. The first would be education, which is what I'm doing here today. Collaboration. So human trafficking is a multifaceted issue. That's why collaboration is a must in the fight. So we work on building coalitions so communities can build capacity to fight human trafficking more efficiently and with more cohesion. We also advocate on a legislative level. When I say advocate on a legislative level, we advocate for stronger anti-human trafficking legislation on state and federal levels. And by the end of this presentation, you're going to really see how sometimes a piece of legislation might not have human trafficking in the title, but it is absolutely anti-human trafficking policy should it pass. And I'll be explaining all that to you as we go on, especially when we start talking about protecting workers. And fair trade. So we introduce fair trade products into the local market. We support fair trade certification. We put our money where our mouth is, and we also sell fair trade as a social enterprise. And that's where the Fair Traders Project was kind of born through that 4th action item. The more people who demand products free of forced labor, the less human trafficking there will be globally. And by the end of this presentation, you will 100% understand what that means and how it's applied. If I do this presentation right, to be fair. So, Fair Traders Project. It's a project of NC Stop Human Trafficking designed to serve as an educational tool to teach people about conscious consumerism and that their spending makes a difference around the world. And it absolutely does. Not only does your spending make a difference around the world, it also makes a difference right here. It provides Fair Trade provides, Fair Traders Project, because we sell fair trade and we support fair trade workers in companies who sell fair trade, provide decent jobs for vulnerable people to prevent them from being trafficked. So the more we support fair trade as an organization, the more customers we have buying fair trade, and it doesn't even have to be our fair trade, it's any fair trade really, the less people will be vulnerable and the less likely they'll be trafficked. It supports the global anti-human trafficking initiatives around the world. And when we get into the rest of this presentation, you're going to really understand how that happens. And any money that we make goes into the nonprofit's mission, our domestic anti-trafficking work. But just so you know, we did not start doing this the Fair Traders Project, doing this to make money. It was actually an avenue to talk to people about ethical consumerism. So this is what you're going to learn today. You're going to learn what human trafficking is, what fair trade is, and what you can do. These 3 points. So with that, can somebody tell me what you think human trafficking is? And you can just put your answers in the chat box. I will wait a moment. Okay, well, we'll just keep rolling. So human trafficking is, and this is the legal definition under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is a piece of federal legislation that sets the standard of what human trafficking is, how the U.S. sees human trafficking, and how not only they see how not only the U.S. sees it within the country, but also globally. And it is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, advertising, maintaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for a labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, debt, bondage, or slavery. What does that mean? In a nutshell, that means compelling someone to work or perform a commercial sex act using force, fraud, or coercion. Force looks like physical abuse, sexual abuse, and confinement. In the United States, force typically doesn't begin the cycle of human trafficking, just so we're on the same page, but around the world, it can start that way. For this specific presentation, we are going to be talking about global human trafficking as well. So what does fraud look like? That's selling the dream. So that's the dream of romance, grooming someone to believe that the perpetrator is a friend, a lover, a protector, or selling the prosperity dream. Now, selling the prosperity dream is more where fraud comes in on around labor trafficking. We'll focus a lot on labor trafficking in this presentation. So that's enticing a victim to work using a form of persuasion that would make that victim believe they will become financially better off. So that is presenting a job opportunity that sounds really lucrative to the person, and then it actually turning into labor trafficking. And coercion. So coercion is the seizure of documentation, psychological threats or threats of harm to the victim or the victim's loved ones, manipulation, and debt bondage. Debt bondage is going to play a big role in global trafficking, and I will talk more about that as we go on. So what does human trafficking kind of look like on a global scale? It's huge. It's a business. Though it is an illegitimate business and an illegal business in many countries, not all necessarily, and it's always an abusive business. Human trafficking is a business nonetheless. It's a model, it's a model based on supply and demand. The more people demand sex for sale or products that are super cheap, the more traffickers will supply that demand. So how much money are traffickers estimated to make around the world? $150 billion annually. This, and just so we know, so we're all on the same page about this number, this is an estimate according to the International Labor Organization report that was actually released several years ago. I want to stress that this is an estimate, and nailing down the exact dollar amount is basically impossible, but this is what we're estimated at. That's $150 billion in profits. After drug dealing, human trafficking is tied with the illegal arms trade and the second largest criminal industry in the world. It is also the fastest growing. That the human cost, and we'll talk a lot about the human cost of human trafficking as we go on, especially towards the end of this presentation, but the human cost is 40 million people around the world are victims of human trafficking, according to that same report. So that's so we can talk about the money, $150 billion. That's a lot of money, but 40 million people, wow, women and children are disproportionately affected by human trafficking globally as well. About 71% of victims are women and girls, and the other percentage, of course, are men and boys, and the smaller percentage being gender minorities. Just so we kind of know the human cost of trafficking on a global scale. And we're going to focus a lot on the global scale because fair trade is a global initiative. So for this presentation, I know you're kind of confused, vulnerabilities. For this presentation, we're going to look at vulnerabilities for populations around the world. But it's also important to note, and I want you to really understand that these vulnerabilities exist in the United States. and in the Western hemisphere as well. Okay. So poverty and lack of resources, you will find by the end of this, will be the cornerstone in creating a more vulnerable population. People living in extreme poverty are more likely to take risky job offers, sell family members or themselves for sex, or sell their daughters to men for marriage. And on a global scale, the selling daughters is going to go hand in hand with gender inequality and discrimination, but we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So debts can lead entire families into financial ruin across the world and in the United States, honestly. So traffickers use a form of debt bondage to keep victims working, and debt bondage is going to play a big role in how whole families are trafficked on a global scale in labor and sex trafficking. So debt bondage keeps victims working. It's also known as bonded labor, debt slavery, or peonage. It is pledging to repay a debt by work or other means with no clear repayment mechanism or agreement, and usually no clear way to see when or if the debt will ever be paid or considered to be paid off by the person who has that debt. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions about debt bondage, please put it in the chat, in the Q&A box, and I'm going to go on to really detail debt bondage. So the United Nations Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, which happened in like 1956-ish, described debt bondage as I'm going to read this, sorry. The status or conditions arising from a pledge by a debtor of their personal services or of those of a person under the control as security for a debt if the value of those services as reasonably assessed is not applied towards the liquidation of the debt, or the length and nature of those services are not respectively limited or defined. Now, what's that mean? I'm going to give you a clear example of debt bondage. This photo was taken from the United States Trafficking in Persons report, the TIP report. The United States puts out the TIP report every year. And the caption on this photo, as you can see, this is a child in India doing brickwork. So, and the caption says, many children are forced to work in dangerous and hazardous conditions across India, often alongside family members in a situation of debt bondage where the trafficker's primary means of control is the manipulation of debt. In some cases, traffickers force entire families to pay off the debt inherited from their relatives. And this is a typical process in many countries across the globe, but also in the United States too. Let us not understand that doesn't happen here. A lot of cases of farm workers, specifically, well, we'll talk about farm workers, but many other labor trafficking cases really, but where the victims are in a debt bondage situation and they feel like they cannot leave because of that debt that they can't ever pay off. And the idea that they can't ever pay off that's what debt bondage is. So just so we understand a little bit about the brick industry in India, since this photo is here, there's at least 100,000 brick kilns in India that employ like 23 million workers. 1/3 of those living at the kilns are children. And according to reports, child labor is incentivized because the wage depends on the production, and families are forced to put their children to work to reach a minimum wage. 80% of the children ages like 5 to 14 who live at the kilns are working 7 to 9 hours a day, helping their parents mold bricks. So how it works in the beginning of the season, because these are seasonal workers and they're migrant workers, and we'll talk about immigration status a little bit later as a vulnerability. So what they do is they take out, this is specifically for the brick industry, they take out an advance at the beginning of the season. They are only paid at the end of the season. To get through the season, they are afforded an allowance as well as a food allowance. And they are then paid less than what they were promised at the end of the season, requiring them to take out another loan to begin the season again. This is clearly a trap that keep entire families in debt bondage, generation after generation. parents who have their children working at the kilns, there's no other way to feed them. There are no choices here. So according to, this is from the International Labor Organization's report, Profits and Poverty, the Economics of Forced Labor. People in forced labor are often caught in a vicious cycle that condemns them to endless poverty. They may suffer personal trauma that will require years to overcome as they try to rebuild their lives. I hope that you kind of can understand how this is a cycle of endless poverty, and there's just no way out. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and I will answer them as we go along. Another vulnerability is food insecurity. So not only is this a global issue, this is also a United States issue. Traffickers use food insecurity to recruit young victims. Traffickers can groom youth with food or may promise resources for a youth or their families. So what a trafficker can do is say, oh, are you hungry? Well, come work here. You'll get fed. Oh, if you're hungry, come on over here and, you know, get involved in the commercial sex industry and give me all the money and you'll always have food. That's kind of what that looks like. Also, the stress of chronic hunger leaves vulnerable people, especially youth, unable to make safe decisions. Imagine being hungry all the time. How many good decisions are you empowered to make? And this is from an 18-year-old survivor in the care of Love 146, not our care, not NC Stop Human Trafficking, but Love 146. So they introduced me to a trafficker. They were good to me at that time. I was hungry and they fed me, and that was it. That was in the United States as well. And these numbers are also going to be from the United States, but it is applicable across the globe. Homelessness. So homeless youth are vulnerable to both sex and labor trafficking because they tend to experience a higher rate of primary risk factors to trafficking, poverty, unemployment, a history of sexual abuse, and a history of mental health issues. And this is from the Loyola University Labor and Sex Trafficking Among Homeless Youth study. I pulled that right out of the study. One in five, and this is in the United States. I'm not even talking about homelessness around the world, which is worse than, in some areas around the globe, worse than the US. Nearly 1 in 5 homeless youth reported being a victim of sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or both. From that study, 1 in 5 youth who were homeless reported being trafficked for labor, for sex, or for both, because labor trafficking and sex trafficking are not mutually exclusive. Another vulnerability, gender inequality. Earlier, I mentioned that 71% of victims around the world are women and girls. And it's attributable to gender inequality. Women and girls aren't seen as valuable as men, so they don't typically are offered the opportunity to go to school or get an education. What they kind of are stuck with is what their family wants them to do, or working in the garment industry if we're talking about a global look. In India and Nepal, and this is just examples of gender inequality. In India, and this is from the TIP report, sorry. In India and Nepal, young girls from poor and rural areas were often expected to leave school to help support their families during the economic hardship. Some were forced into marriage in exchange for money, while others were forced to work to supplement lost income. Okay, so that's human trafficking. Oh, wait, well, sorry. Reports from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Uruguay illustrated that landlords forced their tenants, often women, to have sex with them when the tenant could not pay rent. Now, I know maybe some of you have heard about this issue happening in the United States. That's an example of gender inequality. Transgender youth, LGBTQI+ people in general, are disproportionately trafficked due to discrimination and lack of social supports. And we'll go into more of that in a moment. So let's talk about discrimination. because the last slide was a good segue into discussing all forms of discrimination that makes entire populations of people more vulnerable to trafficking for a myriad of reasons, from oppressive systemic policies to cultural acceptance of discrimination. For example, in the United States, systemic racism in the US has led to African American and Black people being disproportionately trafficked. Laws from the Jim Crow era of the US still live on today when we look at labor protections or lack thereof. Redlining resulted into entire communities being unable to acquire generational wealth, leading to generation after generation of poverty, or being entrapped in poverty. The criminal justice system is set up on the back of structural systemic racist policies that further prevent achieving employment, which is a surefire, and achieving employment is a surefire way to escape exploitation. So, and I'm just talking about the United States right now, but this happens around the world. This is Finesse Limpenga, and she's a survivor of human trafficking from Malawi. She was brought to the US to work in the household of a diplomat from Malawi. She grew up in a poor village without electricity and running water. And this is her story as told to the Polaris Project, just so we know where this is coming from. She was abused as a child and later in an abusive relationship as a teenager. And she said in a blog on the Polaris Project, there was little hope for better. So when this family promised me an opportunity in the US and told me I could get an education while I was there and money to help my family back home, I was very excited. I was going to break out of poverty and help support others in my village. And we'll talk about how women have the capacity to really change the world if they're given an opportunity. But I'll hold that one. I'll put a pin in that talk for later. The traffickers took her passport and then trafficked her for labor right here in the US. Once she reached out for help, she was met with the nature of racism in this country. And this is what she said about it. And this is what was printed in the the trafficking in persons report, because the United States TIP report had a whole section about systemic racism in the United States that feeds human trafficking this past year. Racism has made Black trafficking survivors and other survivors of color feel invisible. It has exacerbated our isolation, increased our stress, and undermined our efforts to recover from trauma. Survivors have known that the justice system is flawed. Just ask the victims arrested and prosecuted for their traffickers' crimes. So those are the words of a survivor. She's now a survivor leader at the Human Trafficking Legal Center. She's really amazing. If you ever get to sit in on one of her panel discussions, they host a few webinars. You definitely should. And it's not just the Black and African American communities. Indigenous people are disproportionately trafficked as well. This is a member of the Little Shell Chippewa tribe of Montana. And she has red paint on her face to raise awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And at the Missoula Fair in Montana, but this happens in North Carolina. We are NC Stop Human Trafficking. So the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women is a problem in North Carolina as well. Native American women and girls are highly vulnerable to human trafficking for much the same reason Black and African American people are too. Speaking through the lens of the US, Native Americans have been marginalized by racist policies as well. And plainly put, throughout history, they have been targets of genocide and enslavement by the earliest colonizers of this country. This is also an added layer. There's also an added layer when you're talking about sex trafficking, of fetishizing Native women, as well as Black and women of Asian Pacific Islander descent by sex buyers, just so you know that a little bit more. And we have a lot of content about this on our website. So if you ever want to read our information on this, you can always go to ncstophumantrafficking.org and check out some of our blogs on Native women and girls, women of Asian Pacific Islander descent, and how systemic racism feeds human trafficking as a whole. So when we look at racism's impact on the global human trafficking, it mirrors the US, However, with racism can be viewed not just through the color of a person's skin, but also their ethnicity on a global scale. We can look at how Roma people are discriminated against in Eastern Europe, and we can look at how indigenous people around the world are discriminated against based on colonization. That discrimination leads to huge swaths of people being more vulnerable to being trafficked. I'm going to pause for a question. The survivor name was Finesse Limpega, and I'll make a note to send out some, if I can find any of her live sessions, I'll make a note to send that out in the follow-up email that I'm going to send everybody. You spell it Finesslipenga. And I'll put the spelling in the follow-up email as well. So, discrimination again, because discrimination is a problem when we're talking about whole populations being vulnerable to traffickers. So this is a photo from the Trafficking in Persons report. And this is a trans woman applying makeup in her home in Spain. Members of the LGBTQI+ community face stigma, violence, and persecution around the world and are vulnerable to being trafficked. They are faced with little social supports, not just around the world, not just in other countries, but right here, and less job opportunities due to discrimination. In many cases, their family supports are also dissolved when they come out. So their choices become so limited that there aren't any. I'm sorry, I was checking the Q&A box. When I send the follow-up email out, you'll absolutely get PDFs of this presentation, so you can refer back, and a recording if the recording does what it's supposed to do. So again, gender. Women and girls are more vulnerable to trafficking because they typically make less money than their male counterparts and are not allowed to pursue an education and are more likely to live in poverty due to the simple fact that they are women. I feel like this is probably common knowledge at this point. So if you have any questions about that, please let me know. But we'll talk a lot more about how women can impact the world if they're just given a chance. Immigration status. Immigrants, refugees, and migrant people are more vulnerable to being trafficked because they don't know the language. They may not know their rights. I know that when I was working in the field, when I was doing my work in the fields talking to farm workers, they did not know their rights. They didn't know the language. They were very scared. They didn't want to be deported because they were here under a debt bondage situation and they couldn't leave because that debt bondage would fall back on their family and endanger their family and themselves. They're sometimes living in a refugee camp with little food insecurity. And again, populations of people without security and are of an insecure food status, without homes. They will hear what a trafficker or possible trafficker has to say about a bogus job opportunity where they're going to make a lot of money and all that stuff. And again, they may be under a debt bondage situation. So, does anyone know what fair trade is? Do you want to, if you do, please put your answers in the chat box, and I'll pause for a minute and let you put your answers in or ask questions if you need to. I'm going to pause for a sec and wait for some responses. Okay, so we've got fair and living wage. Thank you, Angela, you're a delight. Ensures products are produced by workers who earn a fair wage and whose labor rights are respected. Fair trade is a business model providing certain criteria such as wages, environment, working conditions, selling goods for a fair value, and directed to producer. So I'm in the right group right now. You guys are doing great. You're right, you are right there. We're going to jump into what fair trade is now, and we're going to talk about all the principles and link those principles to how it prevents human trafficking, because everyone does. So fair trade is governed by guiding principles, and we're going to look at them. This is the definition of fair trade by Fair Trade International, and I'll read it. Fair trade is a system of certification that aims to ensure a set of standards are met in the production and supply of a product or ingredient. For farmers and workers, fair trade means workers' rights, safer worker conditions, and fairer pay. For shoppers, it means high quality, ethically produced products. We're going to talk a lot about workers' rights and safe worker conditions and fairer pay, along with many other things. So, the principles. Do you know how many principles there are? Did I already say that? Well, if I didn't, there are, fair trade is governed by 10 guiding principles. The first one is, well, it's not the first one. It's just one of them is capacity building, because they're not in really order. It's just the 10 principles you have to go by as a company to get fair trade certification. So fair trade companies are required to have communities premiums where a portion of the profits are reinvested in the community and the producers the producers are living in. So the actual workers in fair trade certified companies decide where that premium goes. So if the workers want to invest in local schools and education, they can invest in healthcare, and that investment in healthcare will definitely lead to families not being trapped in like a debt bondage situation with better healthcare. And we can talk about that a little more if we have time. And invested in infrastructure, whether that be household goods for the whole community or reinvest in their business. So, and just examples of what capacity building can do, what these community development funds can do. In Sinaloa, Mexico, I'm pretty sure I've mispronounced that, my apologies. Temperatures average 92 degrees during the hottest months, and the fishermen in that fair trade company, that fair trade certified company, voted to use fair trade community development funds to install air conditioning units in classrooms at the Altata primary school, where many of their children attended. Man, imagine if we could work at a company that allowed a portion of the profits go back to what we wanted it, right? They're hearing the voice of workers is amazing. This fair trade committee in Bondage in Tirupur, India, voted to create a scholarship for the 18-year-old son of one of the workers, fully funding his undergraduate education. And he plans to go back to that same area one day to be a chartered accountant, serving the manufacturing industry and workers like his mother. Workers voted to send this 18-year-old to college. That's incredible. For tea growers in the Mumbega community of Uganda, paying for their children's school fees is by far the biggest financial constraint. So fair trade funds have helped pay these fees so that children can go to school and receive an education, leaving parents hopeful of one day sending their children to college. Fair trade funds have also built in this community a well to bring access to clean drinking water, enabled food security programs, and improved access to healthcare. But still, many families say that help with school fees is the greatest benefit of fair trade. Now, that is a community of workers giving back to the community, making their community better, making their families better. And if that's not reducing a whole populations of people's vulnerability, I'm not sure what is. Fair trade isn't, because these workers are, I don't want anyone to think fair trade is charity, because it is not. These are just what happens when workers are given a voice and workers are given opportunity to make their families and their communities better with the money that they made anyway. So we got a question. Do we have a list of some kind that displays fair trade companies? Well, we don't really have a list that displays fair trade companies, but there are Fair Trade USA. If you ever go to their website, they have a list of companies, and then you can go to Fair Trade International that has a list as well. And Fair Trade International has a full list of fair trade companies too. But in the follow-up email, I'll be happy to send out those lists from their websites. Organizationally, we don't. So this is a video. I'm not just going to be the only one talking here. Again, these workers have voices, and now it's time for you to hear them. So I'm going to share this video with you. Just give me 1 second so I can make sure you can hear it. Give me 1 second. I don't know why my Spotify is showing this to you. So I'm going to clear that out. Thank you for your patience. Okay, there we go. So much better.
¿Por qué abandonarlos si de ahí está el amor? Está todo.
Para sa akin po, kapag po ako ay pumapasok, nung una-una po,
ang mga bata po ay napakarami ang mga severely listed. Pag po pumapasok sila ay pagpugutom, syempre po wala pong laman ang tiyan. Ay wala rin po napasok sa utak. Napakarami pong school ang nabigyan po ng proyektong ito ng fair trade. Dito po sila natuto yung mga magulang na ganoon pala ang dapat na gawin, hindi lang po sa school at pati sa kanilang tahanan.
it's a big help for us. Kung sila nga ay nakakain, sila ay active, sila ay malakas, they're paying attention.
Yan pong mga malnourished na yan ay talaga pong tataba na at meron na po tayong feeding program ngayon.
In Indian society, the gas stove is something which is used every day, and there is a need of like replacing it every 5 years or every 2 years.
ಗ್ಯಾಸ್ ಒಬ್ಬೊಬ್ಬರ ಮನೇಲಿ ಗ್ಯಾಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಹಾಳಾಗಿದೆ, ತುಂಬ ಸಣ್ಣ ಗುರಿಯೋದು ಎಲ್ಲ, ಅದರಿಂದ ಬೇಗ ಅಡುಗೆನೂ ಆಗಲ್ಲ.
But workers might not have that much extra money to spend on replacing their gas stoves.
ಸೊ ನಿನ್ನೆ ಎಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ನು ಹೆಚ್ಚಿನ ಮತ ಗ್ಯಾಸ್ಗೆ ಬಂದಿತ್ತು, ಗ್ಯಾಸ್ಗೆ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ವೋಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ವಿ. ಇವಾಗ ಇದು ಕೊಡೋದು ಬೇಗ ಅಡುಗೆ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, ಬೇಗನೂ ಟೈಮ್ ಸೇವ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, ಬರೋಕ್ಕೂ ಅನುಕೂಲವಾಗುತ್ತೆ.
And it's not only benefiting them but also benefiting the family.
Una de las que me he beneficiado ha sido en lo médico, mi pequeña y toda mi familia, lo odontológico. Y especialmente con Fairtrade. Sale mucho futuro para nosotros.
Do you want to be happy? Do you want to fulfill some desires of yours which is close to your heart? Same goes to the workers who make your products, who are doing farming of the vegetables and fruits you are eating every day. In the entire fair trade process, the power which consumer have is the most important one, because if they won't buy the product which is fair trade certified, there won't be products which will be produced as fair trade certified products.
Sir and ma'am, ito po ang dapat ninyong bilhin.
Okay. So, give me 1 second. So clearly, being able to decide what you want to do with the money that you make for your community, that gets reinvested, the profits get reinvested back a percentage into your community, and you get to decide where it goes. As a community member, that's wonderful. But now we're going to kind of segue into good working conditions that is guaranteed by fair trade certification. And here is a photograph after the Rana Plaza collapse, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. And at the end of this presentation, you'll really see, there's a preview of a documentary about the Rana Plaza collapse. You'll really see about how we spend our money matters, and the real human cost of demanding cheap products that we know aren't made, that can't possibly be made safely and can't possibly see the producers make a fair wage. But I'm not trying to jump ahead. I'm going to talk about this for a minute. Safe working conditions are imperative to keeping people alive. In this photo, it was published by Reuters, and it captures mourners grieving for those that were lost in the Rana Plaza collapse. The Rana Plaza factory collapse in Dhaka, Bangladesh is considered the worst garment industry accident of all time. And it killed 1,138 people and injured more than 2,500 people. First of all, the top 4 floors were constructed without permits. The industrial factories were operating in the upper floors, with the lower floors containing banks and retail shops. Those retail store and banks closed that day, the day of the collapse, due to fear for the structural integrity of the building. But the industrial workers kept having to work in the garment factory. They saw cracks in the building the day before and pleaded with management to not work the day of the collapse, but the management pushed them to go to work nonetheless. They were rightly scared, because around 9 a.m. that day, the floors of the building began to fall through. And the harrowing stories of death and survival were transmitted across the world after this collapse. Let's keep in mind, it was Western brands that were complicit in the deaths that day. And we'll see a video later in this presentation that shows you the brands. In an effort to supply the demand for cheap and quickly made clothes, they disregarded the people that made them, who were working in a sweatshop. Stories like this, not to this magnitude of human loss, however, but stories that are similar, have been repeated again and again and again. All we need to do is look at Nike, H&M, look at Wendy's, and we'll talk about what's happening with Wendy's too. But we'll talk about all that, all we can do a little later in the presentation. Again, I'm not trying to jump ahead, but every time I talk about the Rana Plaza collapse, it's really tough. And there's going to be a video later that I hope you all can stick around to see, that is really impactful. So transparency and that's a good place to go into transparency. Transparency and worker voices are a necessity in keeping companies honest. So, and that's what Fair Trade certification recognizes this, and it sets the requirements that ensures companies are treating producers well through fair wages and safe working conditions, and overseeing that the certification is only hinged on, you know, that accountability. The workers have a voice at the table and they can bring issues forward. Take, for instance, again, the Rana Plaza catastrophe. Before the collapse, workers at the Rana Plaza had been telling management about the cracks in the walls and the unsafe conditions, and they were not heard, and no one listened. If they had been heard and those managers and those companies had been called to account, the human loss would have never happened. Since the collapse, more people around the world have called for more transparent business practices, but things have slightly changed, but it's not enough, and we all can recognize that. More transparency means that workers are guaranteed to get their fair and living wage. There is no bonded labor, and children aren't exploited. That accountability aspect has to be there to make companies and to make companies honest. And companies who want to have companies who seek fair trade certification want to show their consumers that they are being kept honest by this accountability standard and this transparency. So also, if you are going to get fair trade certified, you got to go by fair trade practices, right? So that means direct trade relationships and long-term contracts between importers and producer groups, sourcing from small farm or artisan cooperatives, higher than conventional market prices, either through above market premiums or price floors, provision of affordable credit, adherence to the policies of the International Labor Organization, especially those concerning child and forced labor, and the right to collective bargaining. So, oh, sorry, there's more. I'm sorry, I forgot the slide was there. The prohibition of the use of the more dangerous pesticides and herbicides, safe working conditions there, substantial price premiums for the production of certified organic crops, external monitoring, auditing, and certification of these practices by independent third parties. So fair trade practices are basically all the principles, and then the principles have an account, being held accountable for that. And it's also a guideline to fair trading around artisans and producers. So fair payment is fair trade is based on the premise that workers and producers deserve a fair and living wage commensurate with their geographic location. Fair payment creates a sustainable business. Fair payment is antithetical to exploitative practices, just like the fair practices are antithetical to exploitative practices, and good working conditions are antithetical to fair practices, exploitative practices, excuse me. All of these principles are human trafficking prevention. And the beauty of certification is somebody's held accountable. So you can't say, I'm fair trade certified. You have to prove it. Again, fair trade is based on the premise that workers and producers are deserving of respect and dignity. So no child labor or forced labor. So no labor trafficking. That's it. It empowers, and also it empowers parents to send their children to schools, which is very important. If you're making a fair and living wage and you're not forced to work long hours, you're empowered to send your kids to school. If those parents who weren't trapped at the brick kilns were not forced through debt bondage to keep their children there, they would be going to school. Forced labor, again, is antithetical to fair payment and fair trade practices. You can't have forced labor and have fair payment. You can't have forced labor and have fair trade practices. There's just not, you can't do it. And that spells it out for you if there was any question. So no discrimination and gender equity. So we're obviously hitting all the pockets of vulnerability here. Fair trade certification requires that companies not discriminate against their not discriminate against producers based on gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and identification. So this closes the gender gap. And it ensures employment practices aren't discriminatory, i.e. requiring pregnancy tests before employment. There's zero tolerance of behavior that is sexually intimidating, abusive, or exploitative, programs to support disadvantaged and minority groups as well. And so when women are given, just so we can talk about gender equity for a minute, when women are given an opportunity to be financially independent and able to make a fair and living wage, not only are they supported and less likely to be sold in red light districts by their families across the world, or into marriage by their families across the world, they're also able to see their children go to school and build up their communities. As a matter of fact, according to the UN, a UN paper empowering girls and women, when women work, they invest 90% of their income back into their families, compared with the 35% for men. I'm not saying, this is the report. By focusing on girls and women, innovative businesses and organizations can spur economic progress, expand markets, and improve health and education outcomes for everyone. So every boat rises with the tide. You know what I'm saying? And specifically for women, women reinvest in their families and in their communities more so than men do. So when you give a woman an opportunity, you are giving the community an opportunity. And fair trade is set up to do that. And it's also set up to prevent those same vulnerable women and girls being sold into sex trafficking or bonded into labor trafficking or sold into marriage. Again, another human trafficking prevention mechanism. So are there any questions? I'll pause for a moment. Okay, we'll just keep on going then. So fair trade businesses partners with producers who are marginalized, disadvantaged in the global marketplace. So this is the creating opportunities principle. Fair trade certification requires that companies partner with disadvantaged populations, the vulnerable populations to being trafficked. Producers could live in an impoverished areas. Producers can be gaining job skills after escaping domestic abuse or human trafficking. And independently owned farms competing with large plantations are also can be a part of a fair trade certification. So a fair trade business is empowered to partner with these disadvantaged or marginalized populations of people. And producers can be gaining job skills after escaping domestic abuse or trafficking. Many fair trade certified companies utilize this one right here. And one of those fair trade companies is Rahab's Ropes, and they offer a job to women who are fleeing sex trafficking or red light districts in India. And them gaining those job skills keeps them living a life that doesn't have to include sexual exploitation. And that's just one example of one fair trade company doing that. Many, many more do. Now, environmental stewardship. This is the 10th principle. Well, is 10th in this presentation anyway. It is required that fair trade companies honor the environment. Environmental protection is ingrained in fair trade. To sell fair trade products, farmers have to improve soil and water quality, manage pests, avoid using harmful chemicals, manage waste, reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and protect biodiversity. Now, I know you're like, how does this prevent human trafficking? The population of people that are disproportionately affected by global climate change are the vulnerable populations. People that lose their homes in mass flooding and catastrophe are weather events that happen because of global warming, are people living in poverty. So they're disproportionately affected by climate change, though everyone is affected by climate change. Fair trade is trying to not only give those affected populations empowering work, but also trying to make a global difference. And I know you're like, how do fair trade companies do this? How do they produce environmentally friendly items? Well, I'm glad you asked because we can show you. This is how our tagua is made, and tagua are made out of actual nuts harvested in Ecuador. And you'll see they don't chop down a single tree. And all the pieces that they're making are dyed from vegetable dye. But I'll show you this video to show you what environmental stewardship kind of looks like. If you are interested in this by the end of this video, because this line is the Tagua Nut Company is really cool. They're based in Ecuador. We carry this line at Fair Traders Project, and I'll give you that information if you like it, but I'm not here to do that just yet. So that's just an example of how the Tagua jewelry is made. I mean, and Fair Traders Project does carry these products. If you want to take a look at them, you can always go to our website and check those out. But that's not like the only company. Like here we have these photos are of women artisans in Cambodia. Then that's another artisan group we partner with as well. And they harvest marsh grass, they dry it, dye it, and then hand weave the baskets and purses. Like, so the grasses are indigenous to the area, and it grows in excess. So the more they're able to harvest that grass, they, make their environment better to live in, because it could, get flooded and stuff. But they harvest this grass, and the way they're able to dry it, and then dye it with vegetable dyes, of course, and then weave it is very impressive, and also an example of environmental stewardship. So with that, the final principle is promoting fair trade principles and practices as a better way to exchange produce, goods, food, and services. This requirement develops partnerships between fair trade companies, producers, and municipalities. So promoting fair trade looks like going to your town and saying, let's be a fair trade town, let's be a fair trade university, let's be a fair trade city. And those fair trade campaigns absolutely are going on across the nation. And hopefully one day as an organization, we'll be able to spearhead one of those in North Carolina. So with that, I'm gonna pause for questions. Okay, I've got most of the people are sticking with me. This is good. If you don't have it, just put your questions in the Q&A box. So now we're gonna go into what can you do? And I feel like the clear answer to that is support fair trade. We really underestimate what we can do with our dollars as consumers. If we demand cheap and quickly made products, we are also demanding that people won't make a fair wage. They won't. If products are so cheap, how can they make a fair wage is the question. Human Rights Watch says that the US spent $2.4 trillion in the garment industry, which employs millions of workers worldwide. Labor rights abuses are rife in the garment industry. In countries around the world, factory owners and managers often fire pregnant workers or deny maternity leave, retaliate against workers who join or form unions, force workers to do overtime work or risk losing their job, and turn a blind eye when male managers or workers sexually harass female workers. And this is coming from the Human Rights Watch. So imagine with me for a moment what kind of world it would be if we directed that $2.4 trillion to clothes that were made by people who were treated with respect, dignity, and people who were paid a living wage. Imagine with me, just for a second, what kind of world it would be if all the US workers were paid a fair and living wage too. It would be a ripple effect the likes the world has never seen. When people are kept in poverty, then those impoverished people really have few choices about how they can spend their money. What I'm saying is it is cyclical. It's a cyclical system. When, again, I'm going to say it, when the tide rises, so do all the boats. Imagine for a moment what is possible if we look at consumerism through an ethical lens instead of through the lens of greed. And I'm going to leave you with that for a minute. I'm going to let you think on it, ruminate. I'm going to move on. The more people who demand fair trade certified products from their retailers, the more businesses will create and sell products that are ethically made and sourced. It is the rule of supply and demand. The more you demand as a consumer ethically made things, the more companies will follow suit, because that is where the money is. Because sometimes it doesn't matter about the human cost for some companies. It matters about that bottom line. 73% of consumers want to know how their food was produced. And most consumers say they want brands to take action on protecting the environment, climate change, global poverty, and gender inequality. So most consumers want that too. It's all a matter of translating that into dollars for companies and reducing the demand for unethically made products and increasing the demand for fair trade certified ethically made products. So with that, I'm going to ask you to tell everyone what you've learned here today, because we've got to spread the word here. I'd like you to remember these connections that we've made about fair trade and ethical business practices and consumerism, and then tell everybody, you know, how it does prevent human trafficking. There's no other choice but it to prevent human trafficking. If we are reducing vulnerabilities of communities and people, they are afforded a fair and living wage, a voice, a seat at the table, not only a seat at the table, but a voice at the table. The more people willing to talk about this and advocate for a fairer world, the more change we will be able to see. But while we're talking about it, we also got to do something, right? Of course, you know, buy fair trade. That's your individual choice that you can make. But what about those companies that are still exploiting people? As people that care, what about them? Well, we are consumers of those goods, you see. We are still consuming them. It is the Western world's money that perpetuates these systems of injustice. And it's up to us to stop the demand. It's like, say no more and call these companies out and hit them where it hurts them the most, or what they care about the most. And that would be the bottom line, their money. I know it may be comforting to think that this type of exploitation only happens in underdeveloped countries, but it does not. Right here in the US, companies are exploiting workers regularly. In a moment, I will show you actually the Coalition of Immokalee Workers based in Florida. They have done amazing work around protesting and boycotting companies that exploit workers. It's the Boot the Braids, and what you're going to see is the Boot the Braids campaign. And Boot the Braids is a protest about how Wendy's refuses to sign the Coalition of Immokalee Workers Fair Food Program. And this program, it guarantees that workers that grow their tomatoes were getting paid as they were promised and were working in a safe environment. And labor trafficking isn't tolerated. That's the Fair Food Program from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. It's pretty cut and dry, but Wendy's has refused to sign the Fair Food Program, but many other retailers have signed on to this and said, yes, we support, you know, not selling products that are produced by exploited farm workers. But this is what the Immokalee workers have done, and they are super impressive. This is their Boot the Braids campaign in New York City, their protest. And I was fortunate enough to be able to listen to one of the Immokalee workers at the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault conference a couple of years ago. Very impactful. But I'm going to play this for you. Just give me one sec.
Básicamente la coalición logró el primer acuerdo con Taco Bell. Desde entonces, los cambios que se han logrado en la industria de tomate y para los trabajadores que estamos cosechando ahí ha cambiado bastante.
Han dado como resultado una de las transformaciones más profundas que la industria agrícola jamás había visto.
Wendy's no solamente se ha rehusado a firmar un acuerdo con los trabajadores del campo. Ellos están huyendo. Ellos fueron a comprar tomates en México, en donde todavía hay explotación. Wendy's sigue aprovechándose de la pobreza de estos trabajadores, sigue manteniendo en esclavitud, acoso sexual y trabajo infantil.
Y han escogido ir para allá. Como trabajadores estamos aquí para decirle a Wendy's que esa es la decisión más equivocada que pudo haber tomado.
We are here today standing in solidarity with the farm workers of America, and we are bringing this fight to Wendy's, because Wendy's, we need your help. We need to stop exploitation in this country. We need to respect farm workers.
So that is like one example, an excellent example here in the US about farm workers and many people signing on to this idea that farm workers and producers shouldn't be exploited for profit, saying, well, if Wendy's won't do it, we're not gonna shop at Wendy's. We're not gonna buy anything at Wendy's until they do. And the Coalition of Immokalee Workers is very impressive. But that brings me to my next point. You can also ask your elected officials to make policies and support policies that protect workers. In the US, this is sorely needed. Farm workers, domestic workers, and what's left of the garment workers in the U.S. are exploited due to little protections. I began my advocacy work after I listened to farm workers. So, and there's no recourse. The labor protections just aren't there. And we could go into the reasons why, but we just don't have time for that today. If you ever want to figure out why that is in the U.S., you can always attend our labor trafficking in the U.S. Session. And it's a webinar just like this. We can also ask them to hold companies accountable for their exploitative and abusive actions here in the US or around the world. I'm about to play a piece of that documentary that I had mentioned earlier about the Rana Plaza collapse. And it's a tough video to watch. So if you feel like you just can't watch that, I completely understand. But I feel like the way the documentary preview is set up, you kind of make the connection between how these workers were treated and what happened to them and that human cost to how we spend our money. And when you read, at the end of the video, when you read the list of the Western companies that had their products made there, I want you to really think on if the US government held these companies accountable for the thousands of deaths and injuries. Please be aware again that the video has graphic imagery produced by a photojournalist who was at the scene of the collapse. And if you don't wish to see this, please take a break and come back. It's about 5 minutes long, and you can come back when that video concludes. Remember, again, how you spend your money matters. It absolutely matters. We do not live in a world where our actions live in a silo. So we play a part. I'm going to start this video. If you don't want to watch it, that's okay.
I started the day normally like other days. Immediately I take my camera and get there. I suddenly felt, am I in a war zone? I was hearing the scream from the rubble, someone saying, chop off my leg and pull me out. I stopped shooting. I was trying to help. Around 7:30, two volunteer workers called me and showed me two dead bodies under the rubble. I saw the bodies kind of huddle each other, holding each other to survive. I started shooting again. I felt like these images should be the voice of these people who died. No one knows their story, how they survive making these clothes for first world country. There's no question contribution of garment industry in Bangladesh in the economy. It's more good rules and regulation. I see the brand names all the time. The tags remind me the tags I have seen in Rana Plaza collapse. people don't want to pay more. So if you don't want to pay more, how the producer would pay more to the worker? So it's like the chain, you know, start from the consumer and ends the labor, you know. Still, a lot of people are missing. They didn't find their bodies. Somebody lost 2 daughters, 2 sons, husband, wife, both. Who will take their responsibility?
So that is just a bit of that documentary. I'm pretty sure you can find the full documentary somewhere, and I'm going to try to find it and link it in the follow-up email. But with that being said, to conclude this webinar, some other things you can do to join the anti-human trafficking movement in North Carolina, or if you're interested in this Fair Traders Project, you can always join us and become a membership. We're a membership organization, so you can join us to help us create communities that support fair trade certification. You can always donate to us. We are a nonprofit, and we run on community supporters. So we invite you to donate to our organization to help us facilitate our anti-human trafficking programs and our Fair Traders Project program. You can visit us at ncstophumantrafficking.org or fairtradersproject.org. All those links will be in the follow-up email. And we sell fair trade products to fund our programs, so and to support artisans around the world. So you can always shop Fair Traders Project at fairtradersproject.org. And now I'm going to pause for some questions. Anybody? You can put them in the Q&A. I hope I was pretty clear about how fair trade as a human trafficking prevention, and it's a prevention of a lot of things. So I hope I was able to make that connection. If I was not, please let me know. If you want to know more about who to contact or what kind of brands to boycott, if you wanted to do that, there's so many ways to find that out. In the follow-up email, I'm going to send information about companies. I'm not companies, but organizations. If you're not familiar with Fashion Revolution or the Clean Clothes campaign, you'll have that information in the follow-up email. And I'll also send you some information about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. If you're wondering why there aren't a lot of U.S. fair trade certified companies, that's a great question. Why aren't U.S. companies fair trade certified? Because they also need to be. They can be as well. Labor protections just aren't there in the U.S. So with that, I am going to take off my video. I'm going to be here. Oh, Ben & Jerry's is a fair trade company. Thank you, Angela. My bad. Ben & Jerry's is also delicious. There are a few fair trade companies in the U.S., just not as much as we would like here. So I'm going to take my camera off, put myself on mute, but I'm going to be hanging around in case you think of questions. I will be here for another 5 minutes.